up my sons. And he's like, yeah, I did. And so Joe said, you must be pretty tough because my boys are tough. He said, you had my son Anthony down pretty bad. You could have kicked his head in, but you didn't. And Sammy was like, yeah, I didn't because it was only a fight. You know, I didn't need to do that. And he said, that's a good thing. That's a good thing you did there. And he's like, now you know they're my sons, right? And Sammy's like, oh, yeah, Joe, because Joe was the boss, of course. That's how that incident went down.
Was there any repercussions?
No, I mean, that's the thing. Sammy, throughout his career, you'll see this kind of these things that he does that you think would be dangerous, but they instill respect. You know, because he is a tough guy, and that's the commodity, right? That's what greases the machine. Violence. You know, he had an interesting time in the Colombos. I mean, he rubbed shoulders with some notable personalities, Joe Colombo, as we mentioned. Also, an interesting character that he ran into in a more positive note for his file, as it were, was Carmine the Snake Persico. He's a fascinating figure. And Persico liked Sammy because Sammy did his first hit for the Colombos, his first murder, but he had taken care of some other business by beating people up and things like this. So Carmine liked him, and he liked him a lot because he saw Sammy do a piece of work and that Sammy was a tough guy. And once again, Carmine Persico is probably one of the assassins of Albert and Anastasia. These guys respect that. He got in trouble with a bank robbery. Somebody reached out to Carmine Persico and said, the bank guard, he's like, I won't testify if you give me $10,000. So Carmine loaned Sammy $10,000 and he gave it to him at 3 points VIG. You know, even though he likes Sammy, that's not a very favorable VIG. Generally, people who are made guys or, you know, really well-regarded associates only get a 1% VIG, but he gave him 3% VIG. And so Sammy didn't have any money at the time. And he said to Carmine, he's like, what do you mean? He's like, listen, let me explain something to you. I'm bailing you out through my power and connections. Money flows up. You give me money. I don't give you money. And then so Sammy at the time was like, he was like kind of bristled at the moment, but then it sunk in and then he realized, okay. And then, you know, of course he would join a club where he would be the beneficiary of money flowing up. So it was a valuable lesson for him.
So why did he transfer over to the Gambinos?
Sammy's sponsor in the Colombo family was Shorty Spiro. Shorty was a real heavyweight in the family. Sammy got into a beef with Shorty Spiro's brother, Ralph Spiro. Ralph Spiro called Sammy's wife, Debbie, and said to her on the phone that they were going to kill Sammy because Sammy was trying to have sex with another Colombo wise guy's wife. When Sammy found out that Ralph Spiro had spoken to his wife, Debbie, like this, Sammy flipped out and raced over to Ralph Spiro's house with a gun. Sammy was going to kill him, but Ralph wasn't home. This made things really complicated because Shorty was Sammy's sponsor in the Colombo family. So the powers that be decided that it would be better if Sammy transferred to the Gambino family.
Wow. All right, so how high had he rose in the Colombos?
He was an associate. He was never a made guy. The books were not open at that point. The books in Cosa Nostra didn't open. The books were closed in Cosa Nostra from, say, 1957 to approximately 1976, because some say 77, but some say, then there's some stories. I mean, I know you're friends with Michael Franzese. I believe Michael states that he was made on Halloween 76. So basically the books were closed. So that's, but he was very well known because he was so, he had rubbed shoulders with Joe Colombo himself and Carmine the Snake. It was thought Sammy is going to be a made guy in the Colombos, but his departure was necessary.
So what's the mechanics of getting moved over to a different family? What does it entail? When
you're even an associate, you belong to the family and the person. So you go on record with certain guys. So it requires like some notice, okay, it's okay that Sammy does this on this end and it's okay on that end. So what happened with Sammy is he got linked up with an old school gangster in Bensonhurst who was a Gambino named Tato Arello. Now, Tato Arello was a very, very old guy, kind of like a father to Sammy, and he was from the era of like Albert and Anastasia, like back in the day. And he was with Anastasia heavily, but then when the whole situation came down with Carlo Gambino, who was Anastasia's underboss taking over, Tato Arello went with Carlo and them. And so Sammy went to Tato first. Tato liked him right away, and he became an associate with Tato Arello.
Was he committing more homicides?
Not right away, no. He was actually at that time trying to go legitimate, and he had a job very intensive kind of like a carpentry type laborer job in construction. He got set up. There was some case that came up of something he didn't do, killing these Dunn brothers. And so he needed money for his defense. So he quit his carpentry job and he said, I got to get into this full force.
So what kind of work was he putting in?
He would beat people up. He would kill. You don't have to kill to be inducted, but it's often the case, but he was putting in work. He was known as a killer. I mean, at that point, I don't think there was a huge body count in terms of murder, but he was a guy that would beat you up and he robbed. I mean, they would go on robbing sprees. They call, like, what was it called? Like trunking, where they'd go and just go through car trunks to make his money.
Because I think he ended up confessing to 19 murders, but he only actually pulled the trigger on a fraction of those, didn't he? Wasn't he the organizer of most of them?
Well, yeah. And the thing is that Sammy will tell you that in a hit, when someone gets clipped, don't fear the guy that pulls the trigger. Fear the guy that puts the thing together. And that was him. And so that's, and then, I mean, I guess you fear the guy who at the very top who pushes the button, but the really dangerous guy, and this is why Sammy is a dangerous guy. He was the guy that would put them together often. Now, this is later down the line because we haven't even gotten to the point where he was made yet, but yeah.
So he puts in enough work to get made. That's a big part of the book where he goes into the basement and gets the card out and the blood and all that stuff and swears the oath. He was very happy, wasn't he? He thought that was like the best, one of the best days of his life.
Oh yeah, you're walking on air. You're high. You're high. It's like a drug experience. He got called downstairs to a basement. At the table are the major captains, the capos, Toto Arello, his father figure capo, the boss of the family at the time, Paul Castellano, the underboss of the family, Anelio Della Croce, Joe Gallo, the very old consigliere. And so he did the whole prick your finger. I don't want to, get you demonetized with the B word. I don't know. What dripped out of his finger, you put on a card of a saint, which, was the saint of the family. And then you light it on fire and you burn it in your hands. If you betray your family, your friends, you shall burn like this saint. And Sammy at the time was so caught up in the moment that you're supposed to take the thing and go back and forth with it in your hand, but he just held it and it burned and it caused like blisters on his hand. He didn't care. He was just like so like high from it. And then he was just walking on air and he went to a club and met Frankie DeChico's father, Boozy DeChico, who would, later have a lot to do with Sammy. Frankie DeChico became a really, really powerful capo, and his dad Boozy was there. And it was just a great moment when, one guy introduces him to another guy. It's like, hey, do you know Sammy? He's a friend of ours. And now his new life has begun.
And his relationship with the boss started out well, didn't it, Big Paul?
Sure. Sammy was always... Now, it's interesting that, once again, we mentioned Sammy was dyslexic. But the thing about it is that, Sammy's a really, really smart guy. He's tough and he's brutal, but he's very, very intelligent. And he had a great interest and knowledge of the construction industry. So Paul, that was kind of a bonding thing for Paul because Paul was very, very much into construction through their control of the various unions. So Paul liked that. So he liked that Sammy was that. And Paul always said about Sammy, even though he's very, very tough and very, very brutal, Paul's a racketeer. But he always said to Sammy, I like you because you are a gangster and a racketeer. And so that's how they kind of bonded over that. So yeah, Paul liked him. Plus, he's capable, and capable in that world means you can clip people or once again, not necessarily pull the trigger, but you can put it together to do it correctly. He was involved in several wars. In the Colombo family was a very violent family.
But he did some infractions and gets called to the carpet, and his life... they're deciding what to do about him. What had he actually done?
Well, Sammy did a lot of things differently. He didn't take any guff, even in defiance of Mafia rules. Now, there's certain rules that are explained to you, getting back to the induction ceremony. They don't explain them all that night. Some are explained to you later, but you don't, raise your hand to another made guy. You don't get with another made guy's mother, sister, wife, or girlfriend. And also, the thing about Cosa Nostra is that you can't kill somebody. The murder is the commodity, so it's very, very tightly controlled by the boss. The boss has to give his consent, in order to clip someone. So I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for some of the times he bucked the system. Sammy owned a nightclub in Gravesend, which is, near Bensonhurst. And it was a very, very, very popular nightclub. It was doing really, really well. He was making a fortune with it. And so he was there with his whole crew. And so a guy started to come to the club, a Czechoslovakian white dealer named Frank Foglia started coming to Sammy's club. He dealt white and he had a lot of money, but he also had some kind of background in, like, he possibly was in some paramilitary something or other. And he was very wealthy. He had, very expensive cars, a plane. He had a lot of money, and it's a little mysterious, but we know he was a white dealer. And,
I was going to say, this is perhaps nearly my favorite story about Sammy the Bull is this story.
Yeah.
Keep going. It's great.
One. So, this guy he dealt white, but he also was a white user. So he was quite erratic and quite, outrageous and crazy. And he had a party at the club. He said he was going to have like 300 people, all A-list. We're going to raffle a motorcycle. I'm spending a huge amount of money on the party. And then so the party comes down and it's like, there's not that many people. There's an old, junky motorcycle, and they have like Chinese food and they're eating it with their hands because there's no utensils. Sammy doesn't like it. Sammy's like, yeah, what are you doing in my club? And whatever. And meanwhile, Sammy, he doesn't tell this guy that he's connected. He's a made member of the Gambino family at this time. But, one of the things that I've learned in my life is that if you meet someone, generally speaking, in this world of, where we are right now with the internet and people cooperating and we know what's what, it's one thing. But in the real world, if you meet someone that says, hi, I'm in the Mafia, you pretty much know they're not in the Mafia. If someone's in the Mafia, they'll never say those words, And I've also noticed if someone says to you, I'm rich people don't say they're rich. They say they're poor. They cry poor mouth, So that's so this guy, Frank Foglia, didn't necessarily know who Sammy was. He probably had an idea that he was connected, but he didn't really know. So he's kind of getting outrageous. He had a deposit for the party. Sammy got so disgusted with the party that kind of blew out of control. He's like, you know what? Forget it. I don't want it. But then Foglia is like, he's kind of a big shot. So he's like, I want to buy the club. I'm going to buy your club for $1 million. And so Sammy at the time, this time in his life, $1 million was a magical number for him. He's like, we're talking a long time ago when $1 million is more than it is today. Sammy's greed kind of got him in, and his brother-in-law, who, he didn't like much, was kind of talking him in. He's like, $1 million, do it, Sammy. And he kind of later kind of blamed him a little bit for, letting him go down this path. So, so basically, okay, he's going to sell the club to Frank Foglia for $1 million. So they have some kind of rigmarole in terms of how to pay. At one point, Sammy and his brother-in-law go to a bank and they're going to give him the money, but they want him to sign for it. They bring these briefcases for the money, but they're like, we're not signing. That's, you don't sign. And so they left. And then, so it was basically agreed that he was going to pay Sammy part of the money up front, and then he was going to pay the rest. Basically, the bottom line is it was going to be $1 million. So that's what was happening. And, Sammy doesn't like this guy, but he's like, you know what, let me bounce over here with $1 million. We can open up another club. So this guy Foglia kind of like starts taking over the club even before the sale goes through. And he's doing some other things that are kind of, annoying some other people. There's another club nearby that's owned by interests in the Genovese family, obviously, pretty much the most powerful family, arguably the Gambinos and the Genovese. And so Foglia, because I guess he has a plane and he has access to a helicopter, he's flying a helicopter over this club with a megaphone saying, don't go to that club, go to my club. These Genoveses are like, Sammy, is this guy with you? What's going on with this? And Sammy's like, no, he's not with me. And it's like, we're going to put our foot up his butt if we catch him. Is that okay? And Sammy's like, I don't know him. He's not with me. So he's a wild card. And Sammy's like, let's get this deal done. Let me get my milli and bounce, because it's not a good situation. He could sense it. What happens is Sammy gets to the club one day, and Foglia, because he has all these ideas, he wants to knock walls down. He's very grandiose, and he's going to do this, he's going to do that. Sammy gets to the club. Foglia is sitting in Sammy's office behind his desk. And so Sammy goes around the club. He goes to the waitresses and checks on them. You girls okay? And they're like, we're okay, Sammy. This crazy guy's up in your office. So Sammy's mad. And as he's marching upstairs, he's pissed. He's like, and he comes in, and Frank's got like his feet up behind Sammy's desk. And Sammy's like, Frank, what are you doing here? Our sale didn't go through. This isn't your club. You don't have a right to be here. You don't have a right to be in my office. And so Frank, kind of a la Scarface, pulls out an Uzi and points it at Sammy. Sammy said at that moment, his body tensed up like a piece of steel. Like, because, this is serious, an automatic weapon right in your face. And so then all of a sudden, Falia starts talking and talking. He thinks he is Scarface, and it's got a monologue talking. And then Sammy relaxed a little bit, because in Sammy's experience, there are certain people that shoot and certain people that talk. And generally, the ones that shoot don't talk. So Sammy relaxed, and he kind of, diplomatically said, hey, Frank, listen, man, it's okay. Enjoy yourself. Put your feet up. We'll work it out, man. It's no big deal. You're going to buy the club anyway. And Sammy just slowly backed out diplomatically. He, his eyes grew dark at that point. He assembles his crew. About 3 hours later, they whack him out in the alley right by the club. They kill Folly in the street. Now, problem here, as I mentioned, you can't kill a guy in Cosa Nostra without permission from your boss, especially a premeditated thing. Now, if a guy pulls a gun on you and you have to do it to defend your life, it's okay, but you can't have, hours in between in a premeditated murder without permission from the boss. So this is a problem. This is a capital crime in Cosa Nostra. So Sammy is called to the carpet. He's called in to meet with the boss, Paul Castellano, and Paul meets him at a restaurant, and Sammy goes in, and, Paul's there with, his big bulldog, Tommy Bellotti, who's a capo, kind of a tough guy. Paul says, Sammy, I'm hearing here you have an off the record hit. And Sammy says, yeah, that's what happened, Paul. And it's like, Sammy, you can't do that. And he said, Paul, this is the problem. It was well known what happened with me and this guy. And I didn't want to have a trail that led from the incident to me going to meet with you on your house on Toad Hill, and then I go and we whack out the guy. I was trying to protect you. That's why I did it, Paul. And Paul said, Sammy, I don't care. I look at this as an off the record hit. And he's like, some of us, Sammy, may be armed right now, and you might not leave this restaurant alive. And Sammy said to Paul, he said, Paul, you are my father, my boss, my representante, and you can do that if you want to. I'm not armed. You can do that. I don't think you're going to do that because I was just trying to protect you. And Paul kind of laughs, and he's like, this crazy Sammy. He's breaking the rules, but they kind of love him for it. He says, all right, Sammy. He's like, listen, I just want you to promise that you're not going to do this again. And Sammy's like, Paul, I can't promise that. I will always protect you. I can't promise I won't do it. Paul's like, oh, God, Sammy, get over here. He kisses on both cheeks. He's like, you ain't going to die over this bum. And, this is just, Paul loves him for it. You're breaking the rules, but people kind of love a rule breaker. That's why we like gangsters, right?
Was that the only time his life was on the line like that?
No, there was another time later. Now, we mentioned that Paul's pet was the construction industry, and Sammy was very into the construction industry too. Sammy was involved in a drywall deal with a member of the family named Louis DeBono. And Louis DeBono was not much of a gangster or a street guy. He was more of a racketeer. And he basically ripped Sammy off for somewhere in the neighborhood of, I believe it was like $125,000, $150,000, somewhere around there. He ripped Sammy off in this drywall deal. And so Sammy called Louis in to deal with this because Sammy's not a guy to be trifled with in this way. Both made guys in the Gambino family. And so Louis DeBono comes in and he meets Sammy, but he brings with him all these like lawyers and accountants to explain to Sammy, why he did this. And Sammy's not buying it. Sammy's like, and they're like, oh no, Sammy, look at this paperwork and that paperwork. This is fine. And Sammy dismisses all the lawyers and accountants, and it's just him and Louis. He's like, listen, you beep sucker, I will splatter your brains all over the wall. Is it okay to say that? Sammy says, listen, you beep sucker, I'll splatter your brains all over the wall. I don't care about your lawyers and your accountants. I will kill you. And so Louis DeBono's like, whoa, Sammy, take it easy. And he just backs off and leaves. So, okay, now Sammy has threatened a made guy. We know this is something you can't do. And threatened to kill him, not whoop his ass, not whoop his butt, but kill him. And so Sammy gets called to the carpet again to big Paul Castellano. And so he's going to a restaurant to meet him, or a diner or a restaurant. And he gets there, and Paul and the administration of the family aren't there. Tommy Bilotti, Paul's big bodyguard guy's there. He's like, the site's been changed. It's over at somebody's house right now. And Sammy's like, oh man. So, he's getting kind of nervous. Now, I forgot to tell you, Sammy consulted with Frankie DeChico. Now, Frankie DeChico is like a big brother to Sammy. Frankie DeChico is a very, very powerful guy in the Gambino family. He's a captain, and he has a huge work crew. Now, the distinction, some crews are work crews. Work crews put in work. They can kill you. There's some crews that are just like more white collar, but Frankie DeChico, and Sammy too, is a work guy. They can put in work. So he consults with Frankie DeChico, who's like a big brother to him. And he says, Frankie, he explains it. He's like, Louis DeBono ripped me off. He brings in all these accountants and lawyers. I got a little mad, and I threatened to splatter his brains on the wall, and I'm in trouble. I'm getting called to the carpet by Big Paul. So Frankie says, because he knows Frankie's very schooled in Cosa Nostra. He's like a big brother to Sammy. He's like, bing, Sammy, I got it. It's just you and him that were there. There's no witnesses. Deny that it happened. Say that it didn't happen. His word against yours. Cancel itself out. There's nothing you can do in the parlance of Cosa Nostra. There's no other witnesses, So Sammy's like, you know what, Frankie? That's some pretty sound advice. So that's what Sammy's going to do. So then later, of course, he gets called into the carpet. And as I mentioned, it's supposed to be at a diner or a restaurant. He gets there. Tommy Bilotti, Paul Castellano's big bulldog goon, is there. And he's like, the venue's been changed. The venue is now at some guy's house. And Sammy's thinking to himself, gee, I was kind of cool with the somewhat semi-public meeting in a restaurant. Now it's at some guy's house. I hope I get out of here. He's a little nervous, so he gets there, and assembled there is the entire administration of the family. You've got big Paul Castellano, the boss. You've got Neil Delacroce, the underboss. You've got Joe Engallo, the very old man consigliere. And then you've got Louis DeBono, the guy that Sammy threatened. And then you've got Louis DeBono's capo or captain, Pat Conti. And so they're all there. And Sammy said he got there, and Louis DeBono's at the end of the table smoking his cigar with a smirk. And he's like, I got this guy. And so Paul says, he goes over the charges, and he says, Louis DeBono says you threatened him. He's a friend of ours. What do you have to say? And so Sammy was there, and he saw Louis like smirking across the table with this big cigar. And he thought to himself, Frankie gave him some pretty sage advice. Just deny it. But then Sammy just saw him, and he got madder and madder. And instead of that, he's like, yeah, I did do that. And I did it because this sea sucker ripped me off. And he's like, you know what, Paul? He's like, Paul, give me permission and I'll whack him out right here and now. And Sammy said that Paul Castellano went white. This white collar racketeer went white with the idea that there could be a hit right here now in front of him. And so all of a sudden, it's looking really bad. And all of a sudden, Neil Delacroce, the hard-boiled, Capone era underboss, tough guy, street guy, work guy, he bellows, this guy here, meaning Sammy, is designing his own death. But I'll tell you one thing. I listened to him, and he's telling the truth. But this other guy, and he points to Louis DeBono, he's a disgrace to our thing. So all of a sudden, Paul says, calm down, calm down, calm down. Because, Paul doesn't want to hit right there. He knows he's dealing with a volatile commodity here with Sammy. And so he's like, everybody calm down, calm down. And because Neil Delacroce basically completely got Sammy's back, because they're the same kind of guy. They see eye to eye. They're both street guys. They're both work guys. So Paul's like, listen, here's the deal. You guys are not going to work together anymore. Okay? We're going to separate you. We're going to end this here today. We're going to separate you. You're not going to work together anymore. And he's like, Sammy, I want you to promise Louis right now, right here, that you won't hurt him. And he's like, Paul, I promise I won't hurt Louis. And then Paul turns to Louis and says, Louis, I want you to promise. And Sammy interrupts him and says, no, Paul, that's okay. I don't think there's any worry that he could hurt me.
That's got to be up there in one of the all-time best stories as well.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, when does Gotti come into the picture?
Well, at the time, Sammy was became a made member before Gotti. Gotti didn't get made as early. He was under a different capo. Like Sammy and Gotti were in kind of different worlds because Sammy was over here in Bensonhurst and Gotti was over in Queens. Gotti's capo was named Charlie Wagons Fatico. And so Gotti was over there. And the way that Gotti kind of made his bones, as you could say, I mean, he was probably on his way to it anyway, was Carlo Gambino had a nephew who was kidnapped. And I mean, crazy idea, but I mean, we know this happens. And so Carlo, it's funny with a guy like Carlo, he stated, I can't pay the ransom because if I pay the ransom on this, they're going to snatch up every niece and nephew and every kid. And this is never going to end. They find out that the guy who did it was a guy named McBratney. And so John Gotti goes to a bar with a couple of guys and they kill McBratney. And so Gotti gets sent up into prison. That's kind of why he got made a little later. Gotti in prison helped a friend of Sammy's. Sammy met Gotti when they met at a club later, like early, when they kind of really didn't know each other at all. Sammy bought him a drink and was like, showed him a lot of respect, and they kind of bonded as two tough guys from two very different factions. Gotti was mostly by the airport in New York, like hijacking loads, whereas like Sammy was in construction and doing different things. But both tough guys, both work crews. Yeah, so Gotti, that's where he came in the picture later. And then, of course, he became, acting capo of Fatico's crew and the innings that hold court at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. Gotti started rising, as we know, the next.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I've got some exciting news to announce. Michael Franzese is coming back to tour the UK in 2024. The Remade Man Tour, the Michael Franzese story. Michael Franzese, once named one of the 50 most significant mob bosses in the USA by Fortune magazine, and a former member of the notorious Colombo crime family, will take you deep into the world of organized crime, sharing captivating tales and insights into the Mafia's past, present, and future. Join us for an unforgettable evening with Michael Franzese, the original Goodfella, as he exclusively sits down with myself, Shaun Attwood. With me as the host, there's going to be a no-holes-barred exploration of Michael Franzese's life, including his numerous arrests and jury trials that ultimately led to his pleading guilty to a federal racketeering charge, a 10-year prison sentence, and $15 million in restitution. You will have the unique opportunity to ask questions during an audience Q&A session, making this event a must-see for true crime enthusiasts and anyone curious about the underworld. Don't miss this explosive in-conversation with Michael Franzese. Live on stage in the UK, this exclusive in-person event will be held in various locations in the UK, Ireland and Scotland. Link in the description box below this video if you want to grab yourself a ticket. Back to the podcast. Cheers.
Step in this whole story is the assassination of Paul Castellano is coming. Don Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino family, picked his brother-in-law and cousin, Big Paul Castellano, to succeed him, rather than Don Carlo's popular underboss, Agnello Della Croce. When Don Carlo passed away, Paul Castellano ascended to the Gambino throne. Big Paul retained Don Carlo's ban on the dealing of narcotics. When Carlo Gambino died, he created two factions of the Gambino family. It could have been Neil Della Croce, who was the boss of the more blue-collar gangster street guys, but then he put his brother-in-law and cousin, Paul Castellano, in charge. So he kind of created the situation where you're going to have a house divided. John Gotti's brother, Gene Gotti, was a major brown dealer, along with John Gotti's best friend, Angelo Ruggiero's brother, Sal the Sphinx Ruggiero. They were major brown dealers. Now, in Cosa Nostra, there's a prohibition of the dealing of anything, let alone brown or white or whatever, but they were major dealers. It's somewhat hypocritical because back in the day, all of the bosses did that same thing, and most of them were arrested for it. And it kind of, I've talked about this recently, how it's kind of a have and have not situation where, these bosses are so entrenched and so powerful and so rich, they don't really need money. But these low level guys like Gotti's brother and Ruggiero, they need money. They're in the street. So they were dealing very heavily. And then this caused this situation with Paul Castellano where it came out and Paul Castellano was going to take out Gotti, basically. So Gotti used that as an opportunity to say, well, it's kill or be killed. So Gotti had to put together his coup group of revolutionaries in a coup. And he went first to Sammy. He set up a meeting with Sammy to get him on board because Sammy was very powerful. He didn't show up though. Angelo Ruggiero came and Sammy was like, where's John? And Angelo's like, oh, he's doing stuff. But he's with me. We're going to take this guy out. And so he said, listen, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to Frankie DeChico, the other powerful capo, my big brother. You got a problem with that? And he's like, no, we don't have a problem with that. And I'm going to talk to Frankie about it. So basically, Sammy goes to Frankie because John Gotti needs the blessings of guys like this to pull this thing off. And so he goes to Frankie and he's like, what do we do, Frankie? And Frankie's like, John's got a big ego, but he's pretty smart. He's pretty capable. And he has to be boss. He's never one of us can't be boss. So listen, let's make him boss. We'll do this. Okay. Let's make him boss. And then, you'll be made capo of your family. And then consigliere, I'll be the underboss for now. If we don't like this in a year, we'll clip Gotti and we'll take over. And they're like, okay. So they meet up and then now the plot is on to whack Paul Castellano. Once again, it's like, who's the tough guy? The tough guy is the guy who designs the hit. And Sammy's been in several mob wars. And once again, you asked, he was in the military. Maybe some of that experience helped with that kind of situation. And so he was the guy that actually designed the hit. And this kind of hit is a real hit. The Mafia are professionals, kind of like the CIA. We're talking about when these guys clip people, they do it right. That's why it's like, Lee Harvey Oswald, with a lone gunman. It's very rarely on a major hit, a lone gunman, and in this instance, Sammy devised a massive hit with primary shooters, backup shooters, crash cars, backup to the backup shooters, walkie-talkie communication. As you know, it's legendary, took place in Lower Manhattan at Sparks Steakhouse. And so Paul was going to meet for dinner at Sparks Steakhouse. This is Christmas time when, Manhattan is just packed with people. Paul goes over to his lawyer's office. He's being driven by the bulldog, Tommy Bellotti, his bulldog. And he's going to go have dinner with Frankie DeChico and a couple other guys, including Tommy Gambino, Carlo Gambino's son. And so when he gets there, all of Sammy's and Gotti's crew are set up. They've got the primary shooters. They're all wearing Russian hats and long trench coats that look the same, so that if someone identifies a member of the hit team, that'll just kind of blur together. Oh, they kind of all look the same. They look that. And it's true. When it went down, the witness's statement, witness statements are always, the reality is hard to kind of track sometimes. And so they get there. Paul Castellano's driving up. Now, John Gotti, they had the main primary shooters, backup shooters, crash cars, all that. And then Sammy and John Gotti were in a car across the street. And Sammy was the backup to the backup to the backup. And at one point, just before it's going to go down, there's a cop. And Sammy's like, he's got a gun. And he's realizing that anything goes wrong, everybody's going to have to get clipped. Because this is, the thing is that when you play the Game of Thrones, you can't lose. If you lose, you die. So when you're going after a boss, you have to hit. That's the one thing. If you miss a boss, you're dead. So they're playing the Game of Thrones here. Sammy and John are across the street. Everyone's in position. All of a sudden, weirdly, Paul Castellano and Tommy Bellotti pull up right next to them. Their dome light is on. And Sammy's takes his gun, cocks it, and he's ready to go. And he's like, whoa, easy. Sammy said if they had looked up, he would have had to take them out right there. But they didn't. They just moved along. And they got into position right in front of Sparks Steakhouse. All of the hitters surrounded the car, took out Paul, Tommy, John Gotti, and Sammy saw the whole thing go down. They drove by slowly. As they looked down on the street, their gun. The regime has been changed.
But doesn't that violate the law of the Mafia Commission?
Of course, obviously, that's a cardinal rule, because who makes the rules? The bosses. So, you're going to definitely want a rule, and you're going to enforce a rule that states you can't hit a boss, because that's you. I mean, that's if you have a commission, there's, a bunch of bosses, they're going to protect that. However, throughout Mafia history, I mean, lest we forget, this happens a lot. For instance, Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino, that's like the predecessor of Paul Castellano. He was the underboss of Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter of Murder Incorporated. Now, Carlo was a very, very mild-mannered little man with a big banana nose and wore his upturned fedora. And Joe Bonanno described him as a servile, a squirrel of a man, But Carlo Gambino was just always thinking he's a Sicilian, and he had Albert Anastasia taken out. So, I mean, if you look at that, that's that's the genesis of it. Now, Albert Anastasia, I won't get into the whole Neapolitan versus Sicilian thing. Albert Anastasia was Neapolitan. Carlo Gambino was Sicilian. John Gotti is Neapolitan. So, there's that whole thing, but we'll leave that for a different podcast. So yes, and no. Yes, of course. But once again, we see that there's rules that are capital crimes. We've seen Sammy break some. He's still standing. And so it's just, I guess everything in life is relative. And who wins in life? The bold. They're the ones who win and write history, right?
Yeah, but there was a response. Was it the chin?
Normally, when you do something like this, you have to get permission from the commission, right? So on the commission at this time, there's the commission of the 5 families of New York. There is Lucchese, there is Gambino. Now, the Lucchese and the Gambinos always go together because Gambino's son is married to Lucchese's daughter. So traditionally, they vote together. Basically, the Gambino and Lucchese vote go in together, and they're the same. The Gambinos have traditionally been pretty close with the Colombos as well. Carlo Gambino basically installed Joe Colombo as boss back in the day. Then you have the Bonannos, who were soon to be disgraced and booted off the commission. And then you, of course, have the Genovese family. Now, the Genovese family is the most powerful family. Now, people will argue that the Gambinos are, but it's actually the Genoveses. And the real godfather, the real tough guy, they call Paul Castellano the boss of bosses, and I've even heard Sammy refer to that. He's not the boss of bosses. That's not true. That's a misnomer. Salvatore Maranzano, when he created the 5 families, wanted to be boss of bosses. But when Charlie Lucky Luciano came into power after he took out Salvatore Maranzano, he said, no, I don't want to be boss of bosses. Let people have their kingdoms. I don't need that. So there is no boss of bosses. And I will argue that Chin Gigante has more sway than Carlo Gambino or Paul Castellano, rather. I'm sorry. Paul Castellano. So basically, the ire that was aroused on the commission would be Vic Amuso, boss of the Lucchese family, and his underboss, Gaspipe Casso, and then obviously Chin Gigante. Chin Gigante, who walks around Greenwich Village mumbling to himself, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, yet is absolutely brilliant. And he is the true, puller of strings. And so, you got these 2 guys that want vengeance. So basically, they want to take out everybody who had a hand in this. They want to take out John Gotti, chiefly. They probably want to take out Sammy, Frankie DeCicco. So one night, Sammy goes to a social club, and John Gotti's supposed to be there, but John Gotti's not there. Frankie DeCicco is also at this club. And someone asks Frankie DeCicco is now the underboss under Gotti. Someone asks Frankie DeCicco, Sammy and Frankie are there, and someone asks Frankie for the card to his lawyer. So Frankie says, I got it in the car. Let me go to the car. So Frankie goes out to the car to get the lawyer's card. When he gets to the car explodes and blows him to pieces. Sammy runs out, and he said he's holding Frankie in his arms, but his body is disintegrating because he's just completely blown up. Now, it was supposed to be Gotti there. So that bomb most likely was for Gotti, but they got Frankie instead. They wanted Frankie anyway, though. Let's be honest. They probably wanted the whole administration. But so that was thought to be Chin Gigante, Gaspipe Casso, Lucchese's, and the Genoveses getting revenge for what happened.
So how did that get settled?
When you talk about ferocious, John Gotti was a ferocious guy. You know that. He's probably the most famous organized criminal, arguably, in history. Sammy is a ferocious guy. Frankie was a ferocious guy. The Gambinos are ferocious. But the funny thing is, who's more ferocious? Who are the ferocious afraid of? The ferocious are afraid of Chin Gigante. Vincent the Chin Gigante. Sammy and John would talk about this. They'd say, like, John's like, oh, yeah, we know that the Chin's trying to whack us out and stuff like that. And Sammy's like, well, what do you want to do? And John's like, well, I think we should just let it lie and blah, blah, blah. It's like, what happened to the ferocious guys? I guess that's the real ferocious guy. These guys don't want to mess with him. That's the Chin.
So they just let it go.
Well, there was never any retribution. That was the decision, because it's like, I guess it's, I don't know, maybe they're super egos. They knew they were wrong in some Cosa Nostra super ego sense. I don't know.
And do you think the Chin had decided that was enough punishment?
No.
Because he could have come after them again, couldn't he?
I think that that was going to happen. I think that he would have. He wanted Gotti. I mean, Gotti was ultimately responsible, culpable, right? He was the guy. He took over. So you got to get Gotti. I'm sure the Chin wanted Gotti, but, then eventually Gotti would go to prison and, he's a little out of reach. But I mean, he was protecting himself. But I would say that they were probably fearful of the Chin, and that's an understatement.
All right, so last time we left off where Paul Castellano had been killed, and we're moving on to where Gotti ends up in a RICO case.
Yes, this is Gotti's first RICO case. It's a racketeering case. He's put up on charges by a federal prosecutor named Diane Giacalone. Her assistant is a guy named John Gleason that will come into play later in Gotti's career and as his court cases go. There's a man named Willie Boy Johnson who's kind of comes into play here. Willie Boy Johnson was a childhood friend of John Gotti's. Willie Boy has an interesting backstory because it's similar to Sammy's in the sense that Willie Boy actually, this is kind of little known, but Willie Boy started off in the Colombo family like Sammy. Then he transferred the Colombo family and he went into the crew of Tato Arello like Sammy. He was never a made guy. Willie Boy was his mom was Italian, Sicilian, and his father was American Indian. So Willie Boy could never be a made guy. But eventually Willie Boy transfers and finds his way into the crew of Charlie Wagons Fatico, who is John Gotti's capo and mentor. He becomes pretty close with John Gotti. Now, John Gotti was a little abusive with him. Willie Boy's a big, tough guy, enforcer guy. John Gotti was kind of abusive with him and referred to him, used racial slurs about his Native American background and things like this. So Willie Boy, because he felt that he wasn't treated well when he went to prison early on, he became a informant, and he was giving them information about John Gotti and the whole Gambino crew. And so he had been working kind of like Greg Scarpa and the Colombo family as an informant for quite some time. So Diane Giacalone went to see Willie Boy in prison during this John Gotti RICO racketeering indictment case. And she said to him, you need to take the stand against Gotti. And if you don't, I will reveal that you are an informant. The reason that she found out about this was that Willie Boy was busted at one point. And he had said, I'm an informant. It got back to Diane Giacalone. And so the FBI was very, very upset with this. Giacalone, basically, Willie Boy said, you can't do this to me. If you do this to me, I will be killed. They will slaughter my family. And Diane Giacalone was quite callous about this. And she really upset the FBI because they don't usually hang informants out to dry like this. Willie Boy was put into this position where he's going to be killed and his family was going to be killed. Kind of unethical. Gotti ends up at the MCC, which is the legendary Metropolitan Corrections Center in New York City, where a lot of people end up in prison or in jail when they're awaiting trial. And he somehow gets to Willie Boy and he says, listen, Willie Boy, you did wrong here. You did really wrong. But if you don't testify, I will not hurt you. I will not hurt your family. And Willie Boy makes Gotti swear on the soul of his dead son, Frankie. And John Gotti does swear on the soul of his dead soul, Frankie, that he will not harm Willie Boy or his family. In fact, Willie Boy doesn't testify and the thing falls apart and Diane Giacalone looks bad and she's upset. At this point in this trial, Gotti employs the services of his lawyer, Bruce Cutler, his famous lawyer, who's like a big, tough guy. He was a former college wrestler and football player, and he's got a very grandiose style, and he kind of fancies himself almost like a made guy. He kind of gets he's very into Gotti, kisses on both cheeks, hanging out at the rave night, and he's very dramatic dramatic in the courtroom, and he opens up the trial by taking the indictment, and he takes it, with a flourish and throws it in the garbage can. And he's like, "That's where this belongs, in the garbage." And so, he does really well. I mean, so Bruce Cutler's a pretty, seemingly an amazing lawyer, and wins the case and gets Gotti off. And wow, what a great lawyer. Well, in fact, what we learn is that's not really what happened. We find out that Sammy had paid off a juror $60,000, and that's how Gotti won the case. And now this case is kind of important.